Three questions, three stories, not one answer. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana delivered the devastating verdict with surgical precision, his weathered face completely devoid of emotion as his eyes locked dead straight onto Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Inside the cavernous expanse of the hearing room, the heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed his words was absolute and deafening. Directly in front of the Congresswoman, anchored firmly to the polished wooden witness table, the plastic base of her microphone glowed with a bright, unforgiving green light. The audio feed was undeniably live. The high-definition C-SPAN cameras were recording every microscopic facial twitch, and the entire room was holding its collective breath, desperately waiting for a fiery counterattack. But she did not speak. She simply sat there, paralyzed, in the sterile, fluorescent glare of the United States Senate, unable to summon a single defensive syllable while the glowing green light mocked her silence. This is exactly how the catastrophic collapse of a political titan happened less than an hour earlier, inside the hallowed, marble-lined confines of Dirksen 608. The stage had been meticulously set for what was universally expected to be a triumphant victory lap for the progressive icon. The powerful Senate Budget Committee had officially convened, and Ocasio-Cortez sat at the center of the witness table, commanding the room with the highly practiced, magnetic ease of a seasoned political superstar who intrinsically understood the power of the camera. She had not been dragged into this hostile territory by the blunt force of a congressional subpoena. Rather, she had arrived entirely voluntarily, eager to aggressively lay out the grand, sweeping economic vision of the Green New Deal for 3/4 of an hour. The room entirely belonged to her, and she was undeniably winning the optical war. With fervent, calculated passion, she wove a compelling populist narrative that began far away from the gilded halls of Washington, rooting her origin story deep behind a bustling bar in the Bronx. She leaned into the microphone and recounted her 2 grueling years pouring drinks, actively absorbing the visceral, everyday anxieties of working-class families as they agonized over skyrocketing rent payments, punishing electric bills, and the crippling, extortionate price of life-saving insulin. This was not some abstract ivory tower academic theory that brought her to the ultimate power centers of the federal government, she vehemently insisted, but the raw, unvarnished, bleeding reality of those late-night blue-collar conversations. Armed with towering stacks of international data, she invoked the unimpeachable authority of the International Monetary Fund, emphatically citing a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure of $7 trillion in global fossil fuel subsidies doled out by governments every single year. Gesturing sharply and authoritatively toward the glowing presentation screen behind her, she framed this astronomical number not as a debatable political talking point, but as undeniable, cold, hard math, declaring with absolute unwavering certainty that the massive funding required for her sweeping environmental agenda was already sitting right there in the global ledger. The money, she argued with the fierce conviction of a televised evangelist, merely needed to be forcefully and legally redirected by courageous lawmakers. The political momentum in the room only accelerated as she smoothly pivoted to recount one of her most famous defining political conquests, the orchestrated grassroots blockade of Amazon's massive corporate expansion into the working-class neighborhoods of Queens. She painted a vivid cinematic picture of a modern-day David fearlessly standing up to the ultimate corporate Goliath, openly boasting about how she took on the richest, most ruthless company on earth. She reminded the captivated audience of how she had weathered the blistering, multi-million-dollar attacks from towering Times Square billboards, and how she had cheerfully absorbed the condescending, arrogant insults of elite Wall Street CEOs who publicly dismissed her as hopelessly naive and economically illiterate. Her ultimate, unquestionable vindication, she argued to the silent committee, miraculously materialized when Amazon eventually decided to expand its corporate footprint in New York anyway, doing so completely devoid of the massive billion-dollar corporate welfare package she had fought so fiercely to dismantle. Throughout her sweeping 4 or 5-minute address, she deliberately deployed the aggressive word fight no less than 11 separate times, and the packed partisan gallery ate up every single combative syllable with thunderous approval. The friendly, purely performative cross-examination from 2 sympathetic Democratic senators served merely as gentle softballs, which she effortlessly and charmingly knocked straight out of the park, further cementing her total dominance of the morning's proceedings. But sitting quietly at the far, imposing end of the long, curved wooden dais was Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. Up until this precise, critical moment in the hearing, the veteran Republican lawmaker had not uttered a single audible syllable. Instead, he sat in deceptive, predatory stillness, armed with nothing more technologically advanced than a cheap blue ballpoint pen and the folded back page of his printed committee hearing program, where he had slowly, methodically scrawled 4 distinct, seemingly cryptic notes in a scratchy handwriting that was entirely illegible to anyone else in the massive room. The atmospheric pivot point of the entire morning arrived when the committee chairman finally looked down to his far right and formally recognized the gentleman from Louisiana, granting him his strictly allotted 5 minutes of speaking time. Kennedy slowly reached out for his microphone, and the resulting electronic click when he depressed the activation button was remarkably sharp, clean, and mechanically precise. In a sprawling room that had been peacefully marinating in polite applause and ideological affirmation for 45 solid minutes, that tiny metallic sound aggressively echoed like the heavy steel bolt of a prison lock sliding firmly into place. Kennedy did not rush. He was a man who structurally and philosophically abhorred the very concept of hurrying. With deliberate, agonizingly unhurried care, he adjusted the flexible metal microphone stand, slowly pulling it closer to his face using both of his hands, perfectly mirroring the exact, comforting physical motion of an elderly grandfather adjusting a favorite reading lamp just before opening a classic novel he had been eagerly anticipating all day long. Settling his elbows firmly onto the polished surface of the mahogany desk, he finally locked his piercing gaze directly onto Ocasio-Cortez. She met his eyes without flinching a millimeter, emanating the relaxed, untouchable, slightly bored patience of a victorious athlete who was simply running out the final seconds of the clock, politely enduring the remaining bureaucratic formalities before claiming her trophy. To the untrained, superficial eye, he was simply old. He was frustratingly slow. He possessed the thick, molasses drawl of the Deep South, and he did not project even an ounce of overt intellectual danger. She clearly felt absolutely no cause for concern as she waited for what she assumed would be a standard, easily deflected partisan attack. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Kennedy finally began, his voice rolling out at a glacial, completely unbothered pace, the words arriving with the inevitable, steady, unstoppable flow of a deep southern river. "Congresswoman, thank you for being here today. You were not required to come. You came voluntarily. I respect that." Ocasio-Cortez offered a single, curt, professional nod of acknowledgement, accepting the polite preamble. Reaching deep into the tailored breast pocket of his suit jacket, Kennedy extracted the tightly folded hearing program, deliberately opening it specifically to the back page where his sparse, handwritten notes resided. He squinted down at his own handwriting with the profound, theatrical skepticism of a man carefully examining a confusing diner receipt, trying to decipher if he had been accidentally overcharged for his morning coffee. I will not keep you long, just a few simple questions, he promised, his tone disarmingly gentle before seamlessly deploying a folksy linguistic trap designed to fundamentally alter the listening parameters of the entire room. Back home in Louisiana, we have a saying, if you want to understand a speech, do not listen to what people say. Count what they do not say. A few quiet, appreciative smiles rippled through the packed gallery at the quaint Southern colloquialism. Ocasio-Cortez, however, absolutely did not smile. She observed him with the intense, hyper-focused, unblinking scrutiny of a grandmaster chess player, watching an opponent's hand reach slowly toward a piece whose strategic, lethal purpose she had not quite managed to identify yet. Lowering his eyes back to his makeshift, crumpled notes, Kennedy officially initiated his sequence of destruction. You mentioned a number that interested me. $7 trillion fossil fuel subsidies. You said it came from the IMF. You called it math. He paused, looking up from the paper, locking his eyes directly with hers once more, the grandfatherly facade dropping just a fraction of an inch. I like math. I read that study too. He intentionally allowed that short declarative sentence to sit entirely undisturbed in the tense air for 3 agonizingly long seconds, forcing every single person in the room to wait in collective suspense as the implication sank in. Simple question, Congresswoman, Kennedy continued, his cadence steady and relentless. Of that $7 trillion, how much is real money? What I mean by that is, how much is actual government spending, direct subsidies, dollars that come out of a national budget somewhere, money that a government writes a check for, recognizing the specific line of macroeconomic inquiry? Ocasio-Cortez confidently leaned into her microphone, her voice carrying the assured, deeply practiced, authoritative cadence of someone who had repeatedly rehearsed this exact academic defense in countless television studios. Senator, the IMF methodology captures the full cost that society bears from fossil fuel consumption, she explained seamlessly, adopting the tone of a patient professor lecturing a freshman seminar. That includes local air pollution, climate damage, public health costs, transportation externalities. These are real costs, borne by real people. The $7 trillion figure reflects what happens when fossil fuel companies pass their true costs on to everyone else. Kennedy offered a slow, deliberate, incredibly polite nod, the exact knowing nod of an experienced veteran interrogator who had just heard precisely the carefully curated, evasive answer he had fully anticipated receiving. I understand all of that. Those are real problems. I am not disputing them. But you did not answer what I asked, he countered smoothly, utterly stripping away her academic deflection. Repeating the original prompt with the exact same patient, almost unnervingly gentle tone, he pressed the blade just a little deeper. How much of that $7 trillion is direct government spending? Ocasio-Cortez paused, the heavy silence stretching for exactly 1 second. She intimately knew the hard data, having studied this dense material for years alongside her policy advisors. The explicit fiscal subsidies are approximately $725 billion. She finally admitted, the number sounding vastly smaller without the trillion-dollar framing. Kennedy immediately latched onto the figure, repeating it slowly, enunciating every single syllable with the extreme, painstaking care of a grade school math teacher writing a crucial formula on a chalkboard, so even the most inattentive student in the very back row could accurately copy it down. 725 billion out of 7 trillion. He deliberately allowed the devastating mathematical fraction to hang heavily in the stale, recycled air of the hearing room. That is roughly 10%. Shifting his physical postures slightly, Kennedy slowly turned his body away from the witness table and toward the crowded gallery. He did not raise his voice for dramatic, theatrical effect. Chillingly, he actually lowered it, forcing the audience to lean in to catch his words. 10 minutes ago, the Congresswoman put a number on that screen. $7 trillion. She pointed at it and said, the money is already there. She said it just needs to be redirected. His cadence remained entirely methodical, systematically stripping away the rhetorical gloss of her previous 45 minutes. She was right that it is math, and the math says 90% of that number is not money, not dollars in a treasury, not line items in a budget. It is an estimate. Economists projecting the cost of pollution and climate damage and traffic congestion. He gracefully acknowledged the fundamental validity of those societal issues, completely neutralizing any accusation of climate denial, but he immediately pivoted back to the unforgiving logistical reality of actual governance. Those projections measure real problems, but you cannot take a projection to a bank. You cannot write a paycheck with an estimate. You cannot fund millions of jobs with a number that exists on a spreadsheet, but not in any account anywhere in the world. Turning slowly back to confront Ocasio-Cortez directly, he smoothly weaponized her own carefully constructed biographical narrative against her, delivering a devastating psychological blow. You told us you were a bartender. I believe you. A bartender knows the difference between the cash in the register and what the owner thinks the bar should have made on a Saturday night. The cash is real. The projection is a guess. A useful guess, but a guess. Leaning in slightly closer to his microphone, his voice dropped a full octave, thick with disappointment. You knew that difference when you stood behind that bar in the Bronx. I am curious when you stopped knowing it. Visibly bristling at the direct strike against her working-class authenticity, Ocasio-Cortez's jaw visibly tightened in real time. She immediately launched into a rapid-fire, highly technical defense regarding the broader macroeconomic framework, arguing vigorously about how complex externality costs are formally recognized and tabulated by every major financial institution on the globe. Kennedy merely sat back in his large leather chair, listened completely passively, and nodded with absolute unyielding politeness as she spoke. When her impassioned, jargon-heavy rebuttal finally concluded, he simply moved on to his very next point without acknowledging a single word she had just said, treating her sweeping macroeconomic defense as nothing more than an irrelevant, annoying commercial break sandwiched between the only parts of the conversation that actually mattered. Second question, Kennedy announced softly, looking down at the back of his crumpled program once again. The Green New Deal. You introduced it as a resolution in the House, February 2019. 7 years ago, he looked up, his eyes piercing straight through the thick layers of Washington political theater. Was that a law or a non-binding resolution? Ocasio-Cortez instinctively straightened her posture, defensively elevating her chin to project authority. It is a resolution that establishes a policy framework for the most ambitious climate and economic justice agenda in American history, she declared, her voice ringing with practiced defiance. It has shaped every major climate negotiation. Kennedy calmly, effortlessly raised a single, silencing index finger, halting her momentum in its tracks. Non-binding, meaning no agency has to implement it, no company has to comply, no state has to follow it. He meticulously and brutally deconstructed the actual functional political reality of her absolute signature legislative achievement. If the resolution passed both chambers tomorrow, nothing would change. No regulation, no program, no funding. It is a statement of values, a suggestion. Her voice immediately gained a sharper, highly defensive edge, realizing the trap she was currently standing in. It is a framework that led directly to the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate investment. She began rapidly attempting to claim credit for a massive legislative victory before Kennedy gently but incredibly firmly interrupted her. He adopted the exact, serious tone of a man demanding a hard pause before a crucial, fundamental truth gets permanently lost in a blizzard of political spin. The Inflation Reduction Act is Senator Manchin's bill. He corrected her bluntly, stripping away the stolen valor. I am asking about yours. The profound pause that immediately followed that clarification was entirely suffocating. In 7 years, has any bill you personally sponsored become law, not an amendment attached to someone else's legislation? Not a framework someone else turned into policy. A bill with your name on it that the president signed. One, on any subject, climate, housing, labor, anything at all. The physical atmosphere within the massive room drastically and instantly shifted, the collective oxygen rapidly depleting from the space. The specific targeted inquiry had suddenly and violently widened far beyond the narrow, specific scope of the Green New Deal. It was an existential, direct strike at 7 entire years of congressional work and political existence. Ocasio-Cortez broke eye contact, looking down anxiously at her neatly typed opening notes, and then shifting her gaze over to the crystal glass of water she had not yet touched during the entire proceeding. The work of a legislator is more complex than a single metric. She parried, her tone desperately attempting to float above the brutal binary reality of the question. The amendments I passed, the hearings I initiated, the public discourse I moved. Kennedy slowly shook his head side to side, the gentle motion radiating not dismissive, partisan arrogance, but profound, theatrical, devastating sadness. I asked a very simple question, Congresswoman. Has a bill you sponsored become law? Yes or no? 5 agonizing, incredibly slow seconds painfully ticked by off the committee clock. The heavy, oppressive silence carried absolute, crushing weight. She did not say yes, and she definitively did not say no. She said absolutely nothing, fully, painfully aware that the definitive, undeniable answer was no, and that uttering that brutal, factual truth out loud inside this specific camera-filled room would instantly hand Senator Kennedy exactly the viral, undeniable victory he so clearly desired. But in consciously choosing not to say it, she inadvertently handed him a far more devastating and permanent weapon. She handed him the sheer, unadulterated power of her absolute silence. Pivoting smoothly and completely toward the stunned, silent gallery, Kennedy's voice underwent a drastic, calculated register change, dropping into a lower, undeniably heavier, and deeply sorrowful timbre. How many families in the Bronx went to bed last night still waiting for those millions of jobs? He asked the room, the rhetorical daggers sinking incredibly deep. How many mothers told their children, hold on, things are going to get better, because they heard a congresswoman on television promise that change was coming? He let the tragic imagery hang in the air for a moment. 7 years. Those mothers are still telling their children to hold on, and nothing has come. For anyone expecting the standard, compliant media networks to ever eventually ask these incredibly hard, fundamental questions, they would be waiting until the end of time. Ocasio-Cortez, acutely recognizing the immense existential political peril of letting this devastating narrative solidify into the permanent congressional record without a fight, did not passively wait for his third question to land. Slamming both of her hands completely flat against the hard wooden surface of the witness table, she thrust her entire body forward, her physical posture transforming completely from defensive evasion to outright aggression. She was utterly done attempting to answer his impossible questions. She was now strictly on the attack. Senator Kennedy wants to talk about legislative records. She fired back, her voice tightly controlled, razor sharp, and practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Let us talk about his... She completely ignored the rest of the dais. She completely ignored the unblinking C-SPAN cameras and she stared a burning hole straight through the old man from Louisiana. The senator comes from Louisiana. She began flawlessly unleashing her meticulously prepared, devastatingly researched counter-offensive. His state has an 8.5-mile stretch along the Mississippi River that the rest of the country calls Cancer Alley. She weaponized the grim, horrifying environmental statistics flawlessly, determined to bury him. 200 petrochemical plants, refineries, chemical manufacturing facilities packed so close together you can see the smokestacks from the elementary school parking lots. Citing an exhaustive, highly credible 8-page investigation conducted over 2 agonizing years by Human Rights Watch, she deliberately and precisely quoted their exact damning terminology, labeling his beloved home state a literal toxic fossil fuel sacrifice zone, pausing just long enough for maximum dramatic effect while the captivated gallery sat completely, breathlessly still. She delivered the absolute killing blow. 7 of the 10 census tracts with the highest cancer risk in the entire United States are in your state, Senator. She spoke passionately of terrified women enduring highly elevated rates of miscarriage, of desperate, panicking parents rushing their gasping, suffocating children to crowded emergency rooms with asthma attacks so violently severe they genuinely, truly believed they were actively watching their own offspring die right in front of them, of entire family trees and generations systematically eradicated by toxic corporate pollution. And these are predominantly Black communities, she stated, her voice thick with righteous indignation. Families who have lived next to those plants for decades because they cannot afford to move, and no one in power has given them a reason to believe anyone cares. Leaning dangerously close to her microphone, practically breathing into it, she locked onto him for the fatal, undeniable strike. You have sat in that chair for over 10 years, Senator. What law have you passed to protect them? You sit up there with your ballpoint pen and your program asking me about footnotes. Read the Human Rights Watch report about your own state before you come to this hearing and question me about mine. The partisan gallery practically detonated. People instantly leapt to their feet in spontaneous, overwhelming adulation. Somewhere in the chaotic back row, a passionate supporter furiously clapped their hands high above their head, while a woman seated near the very front row unleashed a triumphant, visceral yes, loud enough to be clearly and permanently captured by the highly sensitive broadcast microphones. The committee chairman, acutely sensing the massive electric current violently running through the room, let the chaotic, unscripted applause run completely wild for 5 full seconds before finally slamming his wooden gavel down twice in a desperate attempt to restore congressional order. Ocasio-Cortez held Kennedy's gaze perfectly, absolutely refusing to blink or look away. This was precisely the formidable, unstoppable woman who had brazenly fought the Amazon behemoth, who aggressively took on the insulated billionaire class, who survived massive Times Square smear campaigns and relentless CEO insults, only to emerge on the other side, still standing impossibly tall. It was, without question, her absolute strongest, most dominant moment of the entire morning hearing, and every single soul vibrating inside Dirksen 608 knew it intrinsically. Kennedy, appearing completely unperturbed by the explosive verbal assault, simply opened his mouth to speak, but the chairman aggressively brought the heavy gavel down yet again. Senator Kennedy, your time has expired, the chairman announced definitively, cutting off the microphone. Leaning toward his dead mic, Kennedy politely requested a mere 30 seconds to offer a brief rebuttal to the brutal accusations. 5 minutes, Senator. The rule applies equally. The chairman shot back strictly, and instantly the glowing red light on Kennedy's microphone went totally permanently dark. His mic was undeniably dead. Down at the witness table, Ocasio-Cortez's incredibly tense shoulders visibly dropped half an inch in sheer, unadulterated relief. Sitting just behind her Her loyal legislative aide quickly snapped a silver laptop closed and offered a singular, microscopic, nearly invisible nod, the universal, unspoken political signal that the hardest part of the gauntlet was finally over. Across the elevated dais, over on the Democratic side, a relieved senator casually picked up his ceramic coffee cup while another leaned back deeply in his plush leather chair and exhaled a long, highly visible breath. Everyone currently present in Dirksen 608 firmly and completely believed the intense political showdown had definitively concluded. The slow-talking, folksy old man from Louisiana had foolishly brought his primitive ballpoint pen and his flimsy hearing program to a high-stakes gunfight, and the horrific, undeniable reality of Cancer Alley had seemingly buried him alive beneath a mountain of progressive applause. His microphone was dark, his time was up, and the highly partisan gallery was still loudly buzzing with infectious, victorious energy. Ocasio-Cortez confidently reached out for her glass of ice water, finally taking a deeply earned, refreshing sip. But in the treacherous, hyper-calculated halls of Washington, D.C., assuming the absolute end of John Kennedy is always a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation, the committee chairman looked down at his official, typed list, dutifully noting the very next name on the strict parliamentary questioning order. It belonged to the senior Republican senator seated immediately adjacent to Kennedy, a notoriously quiet, deeply reserved man who had uttered absolutely nothing all morning and had displayed zero outward sign of ever wanting to break his stoic silence. Slowly, the quiet senator leaned forward toward his own console and deliberately depressed the button on his microphone, his voice emerging completely flat, heavily procedural, and utterly lethal. Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Senator Kennedy. The chairman hastily checked his thick procedural binder, a look of mild panic flashing across his face. The parliamentary rules were crystal clear. The maneuver was entirely legally permitted. Senator Kennedy, the chairman's voice wavered with careful, reluctant hesitation. You have an additional 5 minutes. The brilliant, glowing green light on Kennedy's microphone flared instantly back to life, fundamentally illuminating the rapidly shifting, highly dangerous dynamics of the room. Ocasio-Cortez immediately set her water glass back down on the wooden table, the water rippling slightly. She shot a desperate, searching glance back toward her aide. For the very first time during the entirety of the long hearing, the aide did not offer a reassuring nod, nor did they reach out to reopen the dormant laptop. The aide simply stared back at her with a completely blank, terrified expression, telegraphing absolutely nothing, primarily because there was absolutely no safe information left in the world to convey. Kennedy picked up his slightly crumpled paper program and slowly, methodically unfolded it once more. He did not rush. True to form, he absolutely never rushed. Before I continue, his voice barely hovered above a whisper, inherently commanding total, absolute silence from the entire chamber. The Congresswoman mentioned Cancer Alley. She is correct. Cancer Alley is real. People in my state are affected. I will not stand here and pretend otherwise. He deliberately let the stunning, totally unscripted admission settle deep into the very foundation of the room. The boisterous, celebrating gallery instantly went dead, terrifyingly quiet. They had been aggressively bracing for a predictable, highly partisan counterattack regarding environmental regulations. They had absolutely not expected a jarring, solemn moment of total agreement regarding the horrific plight of his own constituents. But I did not come to this hearing to talk about Louisiana. Congresswoman, you did, he reminded her softly, seamlessly, turning the trap completely inside out. You came here voluntarily to present the economic case for the Green New Deal. So let me return to the subject you asked to discuss. Gently placing the paper program entirely face down on the desk, discarding it completely as if the training wheels had finally come off, he moved in for the final, brutal sequence. "Final question," Kennedy announced, his eyes locking onto hers like a laser. "You blocked a deal that would have brought 25,000 jobs to Queens. Amazon, average salary above $100,000 a year. The incentives were performance-based. If Amazon did not create the jobs, they did not receive the tax benefit. You blocked that deal." He paused, letting the massive economic numbers sit in the air. "You told this committee today, and I am quoting your words, 'We were right.'" His voice slowed down to an agonizing crawl, every single sentence arriving completely separately, echoing loudly like heavy, deliberate footsteps, slowly ascending a quiet, darkened staircase. "I am not here to argue whether Amazon was the right deal or the wrong deal," he clarified, stripping away the ideological debate entirely. "Reasonable people can disagree on that. I am asking something simpler." He stared right through her highly polished political armor. "After you blocked 25,000 jobs, what did you replace them with?" The profound, unanswerable question landed dead in the center of the room like a heavy stone dropped into a perfectly still pond, the disruptive ripples rapidly spreading outward toward the walls. "Did you propose another deal, a different employer? A workforce development program for Queens? A job creation bill for the Bronx? A single piece of legislation that put a single person in your district to work? Anything?" Backed entirely into a rhetorical corner with no visible exit, Ocasio-Cortez spoke rapidly. She frantically deployed her familiar, highly rehearsed rhetoric about the free market, eventually correcting itself, loudly highlighting the fact that Amazon eventually returned to New York entirely on its own corporate terms, ultimately hiring 1,500 people without requiring a single cent in municipal tax incentives. She passionately argued that this specific outcome decisively proved the system fundamentally works without doling out massive corporate handouts. She doubled down on her ideology, insisting she had valiantly fought for the core, unshakable principle that public taxpayer money should never subsidize trillion-dollar monopolistic corporations, and that history itself had ultimately vindicated her brave stance. Kennedy simply sat back in his chair and waited incredibly patiently until she had completely, breathlessly finished her fervent soliloquy. When the rhetorical air finally cleared, he calmly repeated just one single number. 1,500, he said, letting the pathetic fractional figure hang nakedly in the room out of 25,000. He refused to insult the intelligence of the room by explicitly calculating the devastating percentage out loud. He didn't need to. Every single person sitting in that stunned gallery could instantly, painfully hear the vast, empty, yawning distance between those two numbers without the aid of a calculator. The math was utterly, violently unforgiving. 1,500 people got hired, while 23,500 human beings decidedly did not. And absolutely no one sitting inside that hearing room, completely, including the defiant woman who had just publicly heralded this exact outcome as a massive political victory, could name a single solitary government program that had been created to replace the staggering, life-altering economic opportunity that was permanently lost. Kennedy's voice abruptly changed. The performative, folksy possum routine was entirely, permanently gone. The thick Southern cadence stubbornly remained, but whatever dark, heavy reality lived underneath it now was vastly more substantial than mere political performance. It was the genuine, heartbroken voice of a man who had spent a lifetime driving slowly through broken, forgotten neighborhoods that absolutely no flowery political speech could ever magically fix, fully remembering exactly what those desperate streets looked like when the sun went down and the television cameras finally turned off. When you took office in January 2019, the Bronx was already the poorest borough in New York City. He stated, his tone completely devoid of malice, operating solely on cold, irrefutable facts. 7 years later, it is still the poorest borough. He mercilessly hammered the grim reality home. Not the second poorest, not showing improvement, the poorest. 7 consecutive years. Nearly 1 in 3 families below the poverty line. Median household income 43% lower than the city average. He raised his voice just a fraction of an inch, slowly twisting the knife. The poorest borough in the richest city, in the richest country in the history of the world. And the woman who represents it has not passed a single law in 7 years. He physically turned his entire body away from Ocasio-Cortez, turning his attention directly to the silent gallery and to the invisible, massive audience beyond the chamber walls. He was no longer trying to extract an answer from her. He was speaking directly to the regular, exhausted people who would inevitably watch this devastating clip later, sitting entirely alone, illuminated only by a glowing screen in a quiet, dark room where absolutely no one was clapping. There is a grandfather in the Bronx tonight who is going to sit at his kitchen table after his granddaughter goes to bed, Kennedy hypothesized, painting a bleak, hyper-realistic, emotionally shattering portrait of working-class struggle. Her mother works the second shift at the hospital because one income does not cover rent anymore. It used to, not anymore. He graphically described the tired grandfather patiently helping the young girl with her homework every single evening, operating on borrowed time and exhausting patience because someone had once been patient with him a long time ago in that exact same neighborhood back when it used to be a fundamentally different, better place. In the suffocating, world-altering stillness of Senate Room 608, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez sat completely frozen before a live, glowing microphone, utterly unable to answer Senator Kennedy's 3 devastating questions regarding 7 years of unfulfilled promises. Stripping away the sterile political theater with nothing but a cheap blue pen and 4 simple notes scribbled on a discarded program, Kennedy methodically dismantled her highly produced narratives about a theoretical $7 trillion, 0 passed laws, and 25,000 permanently lost jobs. While her staff later scrambled to release heavily sanitized defensive statements and the Congresswoman dodged relentless reporters in the chaotic marble hallways, a brutal 3-0-second clip of her paralyzing silence spread like wildfire across the internet. It bypassed the Washington spin doctors entirely and resonated deeply with desperate, forgotten citizens like a tired Bronx grandfather sitting at his scratch kitchen table who forwarded the damning clip to his overworked daughter with a single heartbreaking message. Someone finally asked, as the undeniable reality of basic math triumphed over eloquent storytelling, permanently fracturing Capitol Hill's carefully constructed illusions, the devastating viral fallout left one terrifying, unanswerable question suspended in the toxic Washington air, waiting to detonate in the next chapter.